The last speaker today is Stefan Kafidov, philosopher, member of House Collective. His work has been or will be featured in Schul Journal, Rasporka magazine, and it's a pleasure.
Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulation recently peaked in popularity for a short period of time, with many people throwing it in someone's face to finish an argument like they often do with Marxist Capital and Said's Orientalism. We must know better than to just dismiss it as pop philosophy LARPing. Something must have guided a noticeable body of people to acknowledge the book's existence in favor of something else. Some stars must have aligned. The most obvious answer to this question would be Baudrillard's description and analysis of what is now called post-truth reality, not to be confused with a more straightforward approach related to the direct factuality of public claims that was discussed by Hannah Arendt or even Nietzsche. What Baudrillard focused on was the dimension where these facts are at home and not the one where they lack connection with their ascribed inherent value. To him, this hyperreal dimension functioned by its own logic, initially determined by power structures and distributed information within it in ways that end up aligning with the status quo by essentially producing a simulation of a just, sensible system that can be challenged and changed accordingly in alliance with good faith feedback. On the other hand, power aimed to reproduce the simulation of itself to its own eventual demise. In a way, Baudrillard came to a very accelerationist conclusion that resistance only fortifies the mainstream by providing it with a functioning dialectic, and systems only collapse by intensifying on their own undisputed terms. The ideas described in Simulacra and Simulation ended up becoming ever more relevant with widespread implementation of the internet. Unfortunately, this does not make him a prophet, but rather a person that was fortunate enough to describe the pre-existing matrix of thinking that was later applied under our use of this technology. Technically, internet is a shortcut to the process that our civilization started with the invention of language, then writing, then print, and then radio waves, more or less reliably transferring information through time and space, solidifying our stance in the symbolic plane of concepts. Biologically speaking, humans gave up their short-term memory capacity in favor of long-term, which is an investment that only paid off in this fascinating way only recently compared to the rest of the history of Homo sapiens. Our evolution did not halt. On the contrary, we are most likely the fastest evolving organism in the history of the planet. The development has now completely transferred to the fourth dimension of time, which is only a claim that can be made from our point of view due to the otherwise inherent connection of time and development as concepts. Regardless, the medium of that process is not DNA, but the connections and long-term memory that humans draw as a collective body through economies, constitutions, legal codes, social networks, and eventually culture. My usage of the singular number when talking about the human evolution is not incidental. This is why we're unique. We actively evolve in an exclusive abstract plane that exists outside of our immediate atomized biology, thus separating ourselves from other Earth organisms by sheer intensity of this development, but not its existence. When talking about protein-based life like this, intensity of this evolution is parallel with the cohesion of this mass body. Of course, it will never be homogeneous. Even now, we're individually described as dynamics between the conscious and subconscious, different brain parts, or even different personalities in divergent cases. Then social personalities come into play, akin to the show Severance, where organisms are literally inhabited by different persons depending on the settings where they are residing. Cultures are adapters between practical needs created by the system's demands and human brains that satisfy them, or how I'm also going to call them from now on, the wetware of culture. When it comes to historical orders, their oppressiveness and degree to which they monopolized violence were not always directly equivalent to each other. Some systems sacrifice their citizens' privacy in many ways to achieve better efficiency and safety of their populace, while others leave space for more violence due to various factors such as lack of care or impending collapse. In former cases, like for example medieval China compared to other societies of such development, a culture had to be created as a rigorous ritual of interpolation for millions of people decisively different to each other. This can be seen in every aspect of their order, like for example the script meant to emphasize meaning instead of pronunciation, or Confucian philosophy that focused heavily on biopolitical control. Because the system was so well organized for its time and yet stretched out, individual needs and wants were disregarded far more than later civilizations of that scale, due to that need for control and communication, a superculture of the courts that would unite administrative units along with the lingua franca of the period, a function partially performed by religion in Western countries. Every act of communication took significant effort of people that spent decades training specifically to be a cog in that process, which created a system that achieved cohesion but paid with spontaneity and dexterity. This extreme-ish example contrasts heavily with the web as we know it today. While establishing a system of near-instant and increasingly dense communication, it also spans almost all parts of the globe and creates new dialectics on top of pre-existing ones. Internet provides infinite opportunities for surveillance and all its possible manifestations of varying subtlety. It penetrates one's desiring machines, their conception of spaces, their very self. Regardless of how moderated and diluted desires spills here and there in weirdly hidden ways, like the infamous bad cooking fetish content that circulated on Facebook. These videos feature mostly archetypal white suburban women showing off their recipes of, for example, uncooked pasta baked in ovens while wrapped in raw ground beef sprinkled with Skittles, while excitedly explaining it to the cameramen who react to the display in exaggerated content-like manner. This example can be listed alongside many porn-like manifestations of otherwise safe for work notions or activities. The Rule 34 applies to everything at least a little, with an addition that the definition of porn is now more about representation than content. Levels of depravity, heresy, and iconoclasm that people casually encounter on the internet, whether they want to or not, are incomparable to those of previous ages. That brings forth questions which create dialectics where previously there were none. What does the Finnish lesbian community think of the deportation of aliens from Vladivostok by Stalin's government? Would second-generation Australian Ukrainians be more incentivized towards advocating for Australia's boycott of Eurovision than Ukrainians living in Ukraine or Australians in Australia? Are Austrians more into feet than people from Berlin? The invasiveness of the internet forces people to participate in the randomest of discourses and account for suppressed desires that could be ignored before. The safety of anonymous viewing is leaving the content out there for people to see without actually interacting with personal carriers of such desires and views, but nevertheless exposing their existence to the greater public. Whether people want it or not, most of that is now common knowledge to an impressive and endlessly embarrassing depth. The average person that spent their fair share of time online now understands desire better, even if they lag behind on education or social skills, simply because they do not get to look away or unsee certain things. It is true that an accidental live leak visit is not a core part of a young person's comeuppance anymore, but subliminal messaging is still out there in forms that are now developed and firmly entrenched between the algorithms, without exoticism or hypocrisy. Regardless of how much states attempt to control their networks, they will only give the fetish content a new framing. The internet is a place where individuality is separated from the symbolic, unless the symbolic in question is about individuality. Just like that, desire is allowed to roam with no way to stop it, out there for millions and billions of lurkers to see. So what would be the point of resisting such medium and its invasiveness? The surveillance of the state will get to everyone if mandated, just like corporate influence. Any abuse of this knowledge is a political question that, do not misunderstand me, must, is, and will be faced with decisiveness and violence. But there is another side to the critique of the breach of privacy that is so inherent to our datafied reality. Opposition is actually allowed to project its fear of being faced with their own self, with the way in which desire always clashes with and transgresses moral norms. They wish for their incognito tab activity to stay there, and their conversations to remain theirs, not only because they do not want to end up in the most boring and 1930s authoritarian version of cyberpunk, but also because they can't help but reinforce the systems and social codes that constrain them for their entire lives. They mourned the passing of a time when there was separation between one's personas and the link between them could be taken to one's grave, when that knowledge was stored in an organic brain and not somewhere else. The levels of discomfort that people are facing are titanic when they are confronted with the reality of the demise of not only their privacy, but the entire framework that defined it. The individuality, the rights, the focus, everything that was ever supposed to be sacred. As you anticipated, I'm not going to say it never was. The internet is the most accurate mirror of culture to date, as it pretty much perfectly reflects the patterns of our societal production as a species, and when it does not, society adjusts. The unearthing of previous demons is a very common theme online. Previously isolated consequences of our ways of thinking exposed and mixed with everything else, now intertwined with everyone's expectations of the outside world. The recent rise of right-wing thinking and politics can be attributed to that, especially if the timing of it is considered. The surge happened shortly after COVID, when a significant portion of humanity was forced to spend most of their time online at mercy of content farms, influencers, and news websites. All of a sudden, the process of digitalization was accelerated, and millions started feeling more comfortable in online spaces than they were before, interacting with information, producing it, and ever more conforming to the patterns of its representation. The most obvious example of that is, of course, short-form content, influence of which can be seen in the way even White House officials speak publicly, obviously and kind of pathetically producing snappy one-liners that make little sense in their context but look right at home in propaganda edits. This fragmentation of information and the already pre-existing tendency of the masses to look at the titles instead of the contents lured many people in that were previously less in touch with the world, if not on informational and logistical, then libidinal level. Currents of desire intertwined and produced a new pool of wetware with beliefs that reflect the strife produced by the sudden unification, reaction, strife, isolationist tendencies. And of course the tribalism, the egoism, stems from the shock experienced by the exposure. It goes against the digitalizing mainstream and thus creates a hyperreal dialectic of reactionary isolation against digitalized homogenized desire. Of course, there are countless ways in which this dichotomy is challenged, like the use of internet for reactionary or state fascist reasons, but all that can be explained by Baudrillard's analogy with Watergate. The system produces scandal and spectacles of self-punishment to sacrifice a part of itself and be refreshed in all its glory. In this case, the system is digitalization appropriated by the states that preserve a sterilized and molded version of rural ignorance, like in the show Westworld, a curated spectacle of the Wild West, built with ambitious, ulterior motives while presenting itself as a theme park that pacifies people. The ultimate play of current politics regarding this question is that of territories. Everyone disagrees on what signifies what. Everyone is ridiculously progressive in some questions and fascist in others. Forces that can hardly be anything but liberating are used for genocidal reasons. Manosphere influencers are speaking out in favor of Palestine, rich trans women advocate for Israel. For a short time, this was attributed to an algorithmic bias towards ridiculous information, but this logic now lies in the very base of popular movements, like the complete essentialist projection of AI as a technology, with statements that rival Monty Python's writing, radicalizing millions against even being in proximity of anything remotely associated with large language models. What is happening is a complete desync between desire and the link that we drew between reality and hyperreality. A very strong sense of trust has to be placed in information that one gains online, a sense that is overwhelmingly feeble and misaligned with one's subconscious feelings on the matter. It is not hard to imagine that nothing in the world is real. What remains is only libido that must be spent on believing in something. The weak grasp on reality that internet users have is perpetually reinforced with paranoid building and rebuilding of one's map, often forgetting what constitutes it due to the sheer volume of information processed daily. This insecurity goes beyond their trauma, ambitions, or expectations of their parent. A digital subject is locked in Plato's cave and can't help but know it. The cave is right here in their hands, monitor and car. This is how they experience the world. Regardless of how much history they witness with their own eyes, there will always be more of it in the screens. To avoid insanity, moral maps have to be built. Narratives, evaluations, territories are constantly drawn in a manner that must be optimized, decisive and rigid, relating what they witnessed to themselves and assuming position on the matter by placing it within their own vision of the world with them at the center. What must be avoided is uncertainty, and the way of escape is mimification, rapid intuitive moral judgment of a myriad things all at once, creating self-referential constructs that need no further explanations as they represent a religious attribute of larger force that is distinctly hostile or friendly to the evaluator. What makes a meme is that it can be mentioned and no explanation will be needed. A mere utterance will either produce an association in relation to the context of it, or an emotional response if there is no context. Memes are mental shortcuts that organics need to feel comfortable in digital spaces. This statement becomes way more dramatic once the stakes are increased and the digital becomes synonymous with the hyperreal. All narratives previously present in coffee break talks, radios, newspapers, and such are now presented as interactable, genuinely space-like environments. The culture is now in the digital, and culture is what makes a person feel like themselves. That is where the concept of a person comes from. Real-life logic is now indistinguishable from online, as mediums align and abstract thinking becomes inherently linked to connectivity, mimification, and consequences of it. The frantic and paranoid behavior, now normalized and manipulated in digital discourses, is a symptom of humans losing their grip on a significant portion of themselves as they are plunged into something that they didn't quite think through or haven't adapted yet. While flows of information consume us and we consume them, cognitive capacity is overloaded and challenged. However, the digital footprint remains, as does the impact on other people. Now, individual organisms are even less of a primary carriers of ideas, memories, and other elements of culture. The very idea of cognitive substance is challenged, for it is as fluid as the reactionary mimification is rigid. Every day, more concrete concepts are coined that are nothing but the relation of a piece of information to everything else ever created. An example of this are internet aesthetics, like steampunk, Frutiger era, or dark academia. This should not be confused with literary genres, visual languages, or art movements, after which the aesthetics may be called. The aesthetic of cyberpunk, unlike the fiction genre or dystopia type, is a purely vibe-based connection that has no center, no clear border, and is so foreign to the structure that it might as well have it and no one would care. The alleged pioneers of cyberpunk themselves, like William Gibson, would most likely need extra education to make a natural cyberpunk-themed Pinterest board, as it belongs to them even less than it did when the first discussions of death of the author took place. Looking for the first person to say something right now is the same as discerning the spot in a pond that was first hit by a drop of water when the rain is already happening. If we try really hard with the help of advanced tools, we might calculate the implication of a deformed ripple-like structure on the water that collided with other theoretical ripples thousands of times, leaving us with a theoretical place where the process began. How does one put up with a reality like that when their thinking is individualist and their whole worldview depends on validity of the author, social gratitude, and pioneership? They kick and scream, proclaim that enough is enough, and start fighting a dead horse by producing a simulation of what they thought they lived in. The masses start striding for an individualist extreme, one that has not been gaining as much attention as the rise of right-wing thinking, even though they stem from the same source, even if they do not quite go hand in hand. This is not meant to convey a selfish turn that is well talked about, but rather usage of persons as ultimate mediums and signifiers of ideas, packages that deliver information. Names of eccentrics are interchangeable with memes. They are brought up for humor's sake, with no context or to prove a wider point, like Pete Hegseth is the American Prigozhin, or this kid is the LeBron James of child labor. When describing ideas, they are often anthropomorphized with no practical reason for it, which, to start off mildly, is a tendency explicitly seen in the wider art community, where pretty much everyone engages in relatively obsessive creation of original characters, or OCs for short. Oftentimes characters are the first thing to appear in a new proposed setting, even though the later projected focus is on the universe itself. The order follows this pattern because a human form is familiar, and it grounds the observer's attention that is deprived of humanity in the chronically online environment. For the same reasons, ideas and concepts are talked about as if they were people, like Eli is a guy who killed someone's dog. Actual blame is put on an inanimate or non-material thing, a bunch of circuits or ideas held accountable and put on trial. To achieve the same effect in a more sophisticated manner, affiliated people are connected to the product by the public or themselves, trying their humanity as a libido anchor for judgment to be passed. Elon Musk is Tesla, Yankovic is a Ljubljana parking lot paint display machine, Trump is MAGA, and so on. Their social body is extended towards a monster, thus literally making it a part of them in people's thinking. When feelings start to arise towards something, it is anthropomorphized. It is a rule, and it will be achieved in one way or another, either by brute force or subtly by picking a responsible person. While the despotic projection of a ruler, described by Deleuze and Guattari, is supposed to be a way to create and channel power, this process is not a one-sided positive relationship anymore. It has been appropriated by the masses, starved of humanity, that look for it everywhere. Other illustrative examples can be found in new insults that expose the lack of one's humanity by getting lost in a cultural current, like the trend of calling people performative for seemingly showing off their affiliation with certain virtue, like reading feminist literature in public. While there is a grain of truth in that, the trend has run its course, and the current overall consensus is that it went too far, with the critique now saying that no one is allowed to be themselves anymore, somehow introducing another example of what I'm describing. Another fascinating trend is the evergreen soy jack, a simplistic traced caricature patronishly draped in as many signifiers as possible, displaying a person's lack of individuality by drowning them in symbolism, like a face vomiting up fell for it again awards, wearing a MAGA cap with a taxpayer dollars wasted graph in the background. Their faces deformed with the excitement of conforming to a trend, and their eyes motionless because nothing else is there to feel for them. Soy jacks can and are made to describe any archetype of a person that the creator got mad at, with some going viral because of the sheer hyper-specific character of the target. It is mockery of an archetype and an accusation of all who might come off this way in any context, an attack against their individuality that they are allegedly supposed to cherish and preserve. Motivated by this crusade against loss of humanity, people unite into groups and connect their identities to them, fortifying them with mimified connections that are as intuitive as they are synonymous. One is all is one. To contradict the projection of a unified antagonistic outside, they mirror this uncanny cohesion and create a body of their own, an organ in the body of culture that faces this world as one. Protected by this shell, they present themselves, augmented with cultural notions and constructs that they chose to appropriate. They apply the same despotic projection onto their own wide-spanning social avatar that functions as a suit or a face. Internal cohesion grows, and so does the rejection of whatever is deemed negative within the spectrum where the bubble imagines and positions itself. Admitting it will take forever, but the ideal of individual consistency or authority is now positioned within a framework that recognizes it in nothing but name. Same goes for obligation and entitlement, both of which are used as instruments to create performances of these virtues. Whenever someone claims to be entitled to something, they are entitled as XYZ, as a citizen, as a scholar, as an artist, as an ideal that lies outside of them, historically legitimized by terabytes of writing. Individuality is a lost cause, and whatever remains of it is confined to immediate physical reality and interpersonal relations within it, as both desire and culture gained a channel that liberated them from organic supremacy. To return to Baudrillard more specifically, mentions of his writing were explicitly meant as critiques of symptoms of processes described by him. Basically, they were used negatively, essentially ascribing him a hatred of hyperreality. This can be attributed to the way in which the book was framed. Despite the fact that he never really takes a clear moralizing stance and sticks to description, a large portion of Simulacra and Simulation is spent describing the ways in which hyperreality lacks reality in the political sphere, and how all attempts of re-establishing the stillborn natural order are doomed. Same absolutely goes for this talk, as I mostly yapped about the death throes of individuality in the digital age. The only thing that can really see from our current point of view is reproduction of the past by the present, and its geocentric projection of the future as the most obvious natural outcome that justifies my personal beliefs. Writing is therefore incentivized to reflect exactly that, and then be used conveniently some 40 years later, where the author is literally that in his age became clearly defined fuel for production of simulation. Just like Baudrillard himself wrote, once the information gets out, it will be distributed everywhere, not by its own rules, but by those of the hyperreal current, regardless of the intention or its alleged inherent meaning. Out of all examples of viral books that I listed, the usage of Simulacra and Simulation in discourses is only second to the Bible in its irony. That's all.